as the golden sun slipped beneath the Atlantic horizon centuries ago. Its fading light revealed a history few dare to fully confront, one etched in pain, endurance, and stolen humanity. Imagine a vast ocean, seemingly infinite. Yet beneath its shimmering surface lies the silent testimony of millions whose voices were never heard. This is the story of the Middle Passage, a dark and brutal journey that forever changed the course of history. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, ships departed from the coasts of West Africa, their sails filled not with hope but with despair. On board were men, women, and children, each torn from their homeland, stripped of their freedom, and crammed into vessels designed not for exploration or commerce, but for the ruthless transportation of human lives. Among them, African women bore a particularly cruel burden. Their suffering was layered not just as captives, but as targets of dehumanization and exploitation. Imagine being locked below deck in total darkness, shackled to strangers, with no room to stand or turn. The stifling air, the groans of the sick, and the fear of what awaited at journey's end formed a constant, living nightmare. And yet, within this horror, women showed unimaginable resilience. Their stories were rarely recorded, but their legacy lives on, carried through generations in whispered lullabies, in spirituals born at sea, and in the cultural heartbeat of the diaspora. This video is not just about facts or forgotten names. It is about reclaiming truth. It is about honoring those who endured the unthinkable. And it is about understanding how the past still shapes our present. As we explore the untold realities of African women aboard slave ships, we invite you to look deeper, not just into history, but into the strength of the human spirit. If you believe in telling powerful stories that matter, stories that give voice to the voiceless and shine a light on what must never be forgotten, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us continue to explore and share the stories that challenge, inspire, and educate. Now, let us embark on this journey through time, not to reopen old wounds, but to understand them, not to dwell in darkness, but to ensure it is never repeated. This is not just history, it is a testament to courage, survival, and the unyielding will to be remembered. Below the creaking timbers of the slave ships, hidden in the suffocating dark, was a world deliberately kept out of sight, a place where African women endured some of the most harrowing aspects of the transatlantic slave trade. After being torn from their homes, marched for days or weeks across unforgiving terrain, and forced onto ships designed to erase their humanity, these women entered not just physical captivity, but a psychological prison that compounded their suffering in uniquely devastating ways. While the world above deck churned with wind and salt, and the crew busied themselves with the cold calculations of profit, the hold below became a realm of anguish, especially for women. They were often separated from the men, placed in different compartments, not out of compassion or care, but as part of a calculated strategy. Captains feared coordinated revolts. Isolating women reduced the likelihood of rebellion, but that isolation came at a cruel price. In that enforced separation, African women found themselves vulnerable to exploitation by those meant to guard and control the ship. Their bodies were no longer their own, stripped of autonomy, of voice, and of safety. Many endured unwanted advances, coercion, and outright violence from members of the crew. These were not just random acts of cruelty, they were systemic, part of the oppressive mechanisms that governed every aspect of the voyage. There were no witnesses, no recourse, no justice. Historical accounts rarely linger on this aspect of the slave trade, but when they do, the details are chilling. In the rare instances where the suffering of women was recorded, the tone was clinical, almost indifferent, officers and surgeons noting in logs or journals the state of female captives, as if observing livestock. And yet, between the lines, there are unmistakable signs of trauma, Oloda Equiano, one of the few Africans to later write about his experience in captivity, recalled the cries of women echoing in the dark, the unmistakable sound of people being brutalized. His words carry not just memory, but indictment. Despite these horrors, African women resisted in ways that remain deeply moving even today. They preserved dignity in moments meant to strip it away. In hushed tones, they comforted one another. Some whispered prayers in languages the captors could not understand. Others hummed lullabies carried from distant villages, songs once sung to children now turned into shields against despair. These quiet acts of humanity were radical in a space designed to extinguish hope. There are stories, passed down through oral tradition and survivors' accounts, of women who formed protective circles around the youngest among them. In some holds, despite their own fear and hunger, they shared what little food or water they could manage to hide. Sometimes, they even cared for the children of others, those who had lost their mothers during the voyage, or even before boarding the ship. In doing, they not only preserved life, but forged bonds of kinship that would carry into the plantations and beyond, forming the backbone of resistance and survival in the New World. To speak of this part of history is not to sensationalize or assign blame where it does not belong. It is to acknowledge a reality too often overlooked. The women aboard those ships were not passive figures in a historical tragedy. They were active participants in the story of survival. They were strategists, nurturers, protectors, even under the constant threat of punishment. They resisted the erasure of their identity. And yet, many of their names have been lost to the waves. The slave ship manifests listed numbers, not stories. The ledgers recorded the age and sex of the cargo, but not the lullabies sung in the dark, the silent tears wiped away, or the whispered promises to survive. But the legacy of those women did not sink beneath the Atlantic. It rose with each new generation born from their strength. It lived on in the spirituals sung in the fields of the Carolinas, in the folktales told in Caribbean villages, and in the traditions preserved by the Gullah people and others who refused to let the past be forgotten. The story of the Middle Passage is incomplete without these women. Their suffering was profound, but so too was their resilience. In the face of daily indignity and constant fear, they kept alive the seeds of culture, family, and resistance. And in doing so, they left behind more than pain. They left behind a legacy of unbreakable will. As we move deeper into this dark chapter of history, we carry their memory with us, not just to mourn what was lost, but to honor what was preserved. Their strength, though born in sorrow, became a foundation for generations who would rise from the shadows of the past and demand a future defined not by chains, but by courage. The ships that crossed the Atlantic during the height of the transatlantic slave trade were not vessels of exploration or tools of trade in the noble sense. They were machines of profit, precision built to transport as many human beings as possible across thousands of miles of open ocean with as little consideration for life, comfort, or dignity as one might afford barrels of salted meat or bolts of fabric. And among these ships, none was more infamous than the Brooks. The Brooks was not just a slave ship, it was a blueprint for a system. Its plans, meticulously detailed and circulated among traders, showed how over 400 men, women, and children could be squeezed into spaces barely large enough to lie down. The decks were low-ceilinged, often less than 5 feet high, and every inch was measured for capacity, not compassion. The people who were forced into these wooden coffins had no room to stand, stretch, or even fully turn. They were chained side by side, often lying in their own waste, breathing the same stagnant air, hour after hour, day after day. For weeks, if a human life was measured by breath, movement, or hope, the very design of these ships sought to erase all three. The air below deck was a choking, humid mass of heat and decay. Though holes were sometimes cut into the ship's sides to allow some circulation, they did little to relieve the overwhelming stench or suffocation. In such conditions, disease spread rapidly. Smallpox, dysentery, and other infections ravaged the holds, claiming lives before the ship ever reached its destination. And yet, these conditions were not the result of poor planning or ignorance. They were intentional. The architects of the slave trade, including shipwrights and merchants, understood what they were building. They knew the human body needed space, air, and water to survive, but survival was not the goal. Profit was. Every cubic foot of space not used to hold a human body was, in their calculations, a missed opportunity. The most chilling detail of the Brooks and other ships like her is not the suffering that occurred aboard, although it was vast, but the way that suffering was rendered invisible through design. There was a kind of brutal genius in how these vessels turned living people into statistics. The layout of the decks, the placement of shackles, even the storage of provisions, were all optimized to maintain a delicate balance between life and death. Just enough food to keep captives alive for sale, just enough ventilation to prevent total collapse, just enough movement to keep limbs from atrophy, but never enough to preserve the soul. Above deck, the crew moved freely, often oblivious or indifferent to what lay beneath their feet. Some of them, especially the younger sailors, may have felt unease or even guilt. But the structure of the ship and the structure of the system they served left little room for conscience. The design was not just physical, it was psychological. Everything about the ship's architecture reinforced a hierarchy where one group commanded and the other endured. Occasionally, captains ordered the enslaved to be brought above deck. This was not done out of mercy, but necessity. Exercise, they believed, would make the captives more marketable. And so, under watchful eyes and armed guards, the chained were made to dance to the beat of drums, their movements accompanied not by music, but by whips. This grotesque parody of vitality was not a reprieve, but another form of control, a cruel reminder that even motion was no longer theirs to command. And yet, even in these moments of orchestrated movement, signs of resistance emerged. The people brought aboard the Brooks and other ships like her came from diverse cultures and regions, many speaking different languages. But below deck, in the dark, they learned to communicate with glances, gestures, and whispered tongues. They found ways to sabotage, to hide tools, even to plan uprisings when the opportunity presented itself. The very confines designed to suppress them became crucibles of solidarity. But what remains most horrifying is the way these ship designs were treated not as shameful secrets, but as public documents. In Britain, diagrams of the Brooks were circulated not just among traders, but later by abolitionists who used them as undeniable proof of inhumanity. Seeing the illustrations' tiny figures crammed like goods into every possible space, many who had been indifferent were stirred into action. The cold logic of the ship's design spoke louder than words. It showed that cruelty was not a byproduct of the system, but its foundation. These ships did not merely carry people, they carried a worldview, a belief that some lives could be measured in feet and inches, in market value, in survival rates. That belief was written into the beams and boards of the vessels, into the iron that shackled wrists and ankles, into the ledgers that recorded deaths like inventory loss, and it was carried not only across oceans but into laws, institutions, and generations that followed. Today, the legacy of those designs lingers. The blueprints of ships like the Brooks remind us that architecture can be used not just to shelter life, but to exploit it. They teach us that when structures are built without empathy, they become instruments of suffering. And they call us to remember always that the horrors of the past were not inevitable. They were engineered. The story of the slave ship is not just about transport. It is about the deliberate, systematic reduction of humanity into profit. It is about what happens when the pursuit of wealth silences the cries from the dark. And it is about those who, even in the smallest spaces, found ways to survive, to remember, and to resist. They were human beings, mothers, daughters, sons, warriors, farmers, each carrying stories, dreams, and names given by loved ones. But aboard the floating prisons of the transatlantic slave trade, their identities were erased, replaced by numbers, measurements, and shortened notations in a captain's ledger. This was not accidental. It was systematic. On ships like the Brooks and countless others, the enslaved were not seen as people, but as paperwork. From these voyages rarely acknowledged humanity. Instead, it detailed units of labor, profits per head, and losses, as if dealing with crates of merchandise rather than the souls of living, breathing men and women. The language of dehumanization was not just an oversight, it was a tool. In ledgers and logbooks, Africans were listed alongside rum, cotton, or firearms. A healthy young man might be labeled with a weight estimate, a code for his condition and his projected resale value. An enslaved woman might be tagged as damaged if she had been abused or showed signs of resistance. Children, sometimes mere toddlers, were valued based on their potential labor output. The callous phrasing reduced lives into numbers and assigned them a worth not based on their humanity, but on the profit they could yield at auction. Behind this bureaucratic coldness was a cruel efficiency. Slave ships, particularly those departing from ports like Liverpool or Nantes, operate on tight margins and brutal economics. Shipowners invested heavily in their voyages, calculating returns as one would in any other commercial venture. To them, each enslaved person represented capital, and each death was a financial liability. This mindset had horrifying consequences. The suffering of the enslaved was not only tolerated, it was often optimized for monetary return. Diets were adjusted just enough to keep captives alive for sale, not necessarily healthy. Space was calculated to the inch, not for comfort, but to maximize capacity. Those too sick to survive the journey were sometimes thrown overboard, not only to conserve supplies but, in some infamous cases, to claim insurance compensation for lost goods. Insurance played a particularly grim role in this narrative. Policies were drawn up not to protect the enslaved but to safeguard profits. In one of the most chilling cases, the infamous Zong massacre of 1781, over 100 enslaved Africans were thrown into the ocean under the claim that there was not enough water on board. The ship's owners later filed an insurance claim, arguing that the enslaved had been jettisoned as a necessity for survival and were thus a legitimate loss of cargo. This incident was not isolated. It was an example of how financial instruments, insurance, shipping contracts, even bank loans were interwoven with the machinery of human suffering, cloaked in the language of business. Even after the ships reached the Americas, this mindset persisted. Auction blocks displayed human beings as though they were livestock. Men were examined like oxen. Women were paraded for both labor and other exploitative purposes. And children were torn from parents without hesitation. Advertisements for slave sales spoke of prime stock, breeding females, and boys with good teeth. The terminology did not soften over time, it hardened, becoming part of the common language of trade in the colonies. This dehumanization served more than just the financial system. It numbed the conscience. By reducing individuals to cargo, it became easier for merchants, sailors, buyers, and even bystanders to overlook the brutality unfolding in plain sight. If a ledger says 40 units deceased, it is easier to ignore the fact that those units were fathers, daughters, or pregnant women who died chained in darkness. This language created distance, a buffer between conscience and cruelty, between numbers on a page and screams in the hold. And yet, within these systems of brutal abstraction, resistance flickered. Some captives refused food. asserting control over their bodies in the only way they could. Others tried to break their chains, to escape into the ocean, even if it meant drowning rather than being sold. Mothers sang lullabies to their children in the cramped holes, preserving culture and memory despite every effort to erase them. These acts, recorded nowhere in the ledgers, speak louder than the cold figures scribbled by clerks and captains. Today, those old shipping logs are kept in archives yellowed, brittle, and often behind glass. But for all their formality, they tell only part of the story. They do not capture the cries that echoed through the decks at night, the prayers whispered in dozens of African languages, or the names never recorded. They do not show the faces of the stolen, nor the generations changed forever by their forced removal. What they do reveal, though, is a system meticulously designed to deny humanity. And in recognizing this, we honor the truth that every name erased, every story not written down, and every number in those ledgers once belonged to a human being who mattered. Under the suffocating heat of the Atlantic sun, the decks of the slave ship creaked as the sea heaved gently beneath it. But there was no peace within its wooden hull. Below, in the unlit bowels of the ship, women and children lay shackled in silence, or as close to silence as they could manage amid the stench of decay. The cries of suffering, and the suffocating proximity of hundreds of human bodies crammed into spaces smaller than coffins. The journey across the Atlantic, known to history as the Middle Passage, was not merely a transit from one continent to another. It was a descent into a world where fear, cruelty, and domination were enforced not just through confinement, but through tools of pain. Among the most notorious methods of maintaining control over the enslaved were physical instruments designed not just to punish but to terrify. Fear was the most potent weapon wielded aboard these ships, more effective than chains, more persuasive than threats. And fear was made visible in the instruments kept close at hand by the crew. The cat o' nine tails, a whip made from 9 knotted cords, each capable of tearing flesh from bone, was used to punish perceived disobedience or merely to set an example. Its lashings echoed through the lower decks, a sound that carried not only pain but a clear message to others. Resistance would be met with cruelty. Those whipped often bore scars for life if they lived. Infection was common, and for some, the whip was a death sentence dealt in parts. For others, the punishment was even more dehumanizing. Iron masks, fitted tightly over the face, sometimes with grotesque features molded into them, were used to prevent speaking or biting, especially during feeding. But these masks served another purpose: they erased individuality. The wearer was rendered faceless, stripped of expression, and further alienated from any sense of self or humanity. Wearing one for hours or days could cause unbearable pain, not to mention psychological trauma that went far beyond the duration of the punishment. Then there were thumb screws, small but devastating devices used to crush the fingers of those accused of rebellion or insubordination. The slow turning of a screw would grind bone against bone until the pain became unbearable. Their use was not always tied to a specific action. Sometimes, it was merely a threat, a demonstration to all of what could happen if order was not maintained. Each instrument, no matter how crude or complex, served a calculated purpose: to break the spirit of the captives. The enslaved were not only transported across oceans, but reshaped into something their captors believed could be owned, controlled, sold. These tools were essential to that process of deconstruction. The goal was never just to punish, but to obliterate any sense of resistance, dignity, or hope. The horror of this system was compounded by the fact that such acts were institutionalized. These were not rogue cruelties of individual sadists. They were part of a systematic protocol, accepted and even expected aboard many ships. Captains kept logs not just of cargo and weather, but of punishments administered. Records exist detailing the use of whips, masks, and screws not as aberrations, but as routine parts of shipboard management. And through all this, The enslaved were expected to survive, to endure, to reach the shores of the New World as salable goods. It is a cruel irony that many did survive, not because the system showed mercy, but because it calculated the minimum level of sustenance and control necessary to deliver living bodies to market. And when one did not survive, the body was discarded, often into the sea, sometimes still chained to others. These acts of violence did more than inflict pain, they marked an erasure of personhood. In the eyes of the system, these were not individuals with names, families, or memories. They were units of labor, potential profits, statistics in a ledger. But in truth, each person had a story, and for many, that story ended not in the fields of the Americas, but in the terror and silence of the hold, broken not just by distance, but by the cold efficiency of torture. This brutal reality underpinned every mile of the Middle Passage. It is impossible to understand the full weight of the transatlantic slave trade without acknowledging not only the numbers and logistics, but the day-to-day terror endured by those who were forced into it. Every whip, every mask, every screw was part of a deliberate machinery designed to erase resistance through pain and fear. And yet, even through such darkness, there were moments of resistance, quiet, unseen, but powerful. Some sang in the dark, some prayed, some refused food in protest, others plotted rebellion despite knowing the odds were impossible. These acts, small and scattered as they were, remained potent reminders that no system, no matter how brutal, could ever fully extinguish the human will. As we reflect on this history, let us not look away from the cruelty, for in understanding the full depth of the suffering, we better honor the strength of those who endured it and the memory of those who did not. Of all the horrors endured aboard the transatlantic slave ships, few were as insidious as the slow, inescapable grip of disease and starvation. From the moment captives were forced below deck, crammed shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating darkness of the ship's hold, their bodies were thrown into a struggle for survival that many would not win. The air beneath those decks was stale and thick with the stench of sweat, blood, vomit, and excrement. The design of the slave ships, prioritizing human cargo over human dignity, created the perfect breeding ground for sickness. These ships were not meant to carry people as passengers. They were built to transport commodities. The enslaved were packed tightly, often with less than 2 feet of vertical space, chained together in rows so close that even turning one's body was nearly impossible. In these conditions, there was no privacy, no sanitation, no opportunity for proper rest or recovery. Waste from bodies accumulated quickly. The foul air became unbearable. Skin diseases spread from person to person. Fevers took hold, and every breath became a battle. Food, when it was given, was scarce and of such poor quality that it provided little nutrition. Water was often rationed or tainted. Meals consisted of unfamiliar and spoiled rations, stale biscuits, boiled beans, or rice, sometimes infested with insects. The ship's crew, driven more by profit than mercy, often withheld food as punishment or simply to conserve supplies. Some captives, unable to digest the foreign fare, weakened further. Others, in despair, refused to eat altogether, prompting the crew to force-feed them through crude instruments to keep them alive only for eventual sale. Outbreaks of dysentery, smallpox, and scurvy were common. In the enclosed belly of the ship, these diseases spread unchecked, with each passing day. The coughing, groaning, and silence of death became more frequent. Once the first signs of illness appeared, it rarely took long before entire sections of the hold were infected. The crew, unwilling or unable to treat the sick, often resorted to cruel logic. The dying were sometimes thrown overboard to prevent contamination and preserve the value of the remaining human cargo. The psychological toll was immense. Parents watched their children waste away. Friends lay side by side, only one waking the next morning. Women who had already endured sexual violence now faced another form of suffering, watching helplessly as sickness stripped their bodies and spirits. Hope drained as the ocean stretched endlessly beyond the wooden hull. Days blended into nights. The shrieks of the dying echoed beneath the sound of the waves and creaking timbers. Mortality rates varied by voyage, but on some ships, nearly half of the captives perished before reaching shore. The losses were staggering, yet they were often written off in logbooks as mere numbers. A reduction in inventory, a financial inconvenience. There were no funerals, no mourning. The dead were disposed of like waste tossed into the sea with iron weights chained to their limbs. Their names, if they had ever been known to the crew, were not recorded. What makes this even more haunting is the knowledge that this was not an accidental tragedy. It was a known consequence of a system that prioritized profit above life. Ship owners, traders, and insurers all calculated acceptable loss margins. Mortality was expected, even planned for. The suffering of thousands was not seen as a failure of humanity, but as a cost of doing business. And yet, amidst this devastation, stories of survival endure. Some captives lived through the Middle Passage, not because of any mercy shown by their captors, but through sheer will, resilience, and the hope that one day, the torment would end. They became the first to bear witness to one of the darkest chapters in history, carrying with them the pain and strength of those who never made it to shore. Their descendants carry that legacy still. The horrors of disease and starvation aboard these ships were not just symptoms of neglect, they were embedded in the very design of the transatlantic slave trade. This suffering was industrialized, calculated, and repeated across centuries. And yet, remembering it today is essential not only to honor those lost, but to ensure that such cruelty is never accepted again, in any form. Even in the suffocating darkness of the slave ship's lower deck, where air was thick with the stench of sweat, sickness, and sorrow, flickers of human spirit refused to be extinguished. The enslaved Africans, though torn from their homes and shackled like cargo, carried with them a legacy far more powerful than any chain resistance. Amid the brutal conditions, the iron cuffs that bruised their limbs, the echo of the whip slicing through silence, the cruel hands of captors seeking to erase their identity somewhere in that despair. Courage endured, and not just courage, but strategy, unity, and will. Resistance took many forms, none of them easy, all of them dangerous. Sometimes it began with whispers spoken in native tongues across the narrow gaps between shackled bodies. These murmurs became plans, and plans became actions. One such revolt took place aboard the Amistad, a Spanish ship that became infamous after a group of enslaved men, led by Sengbi known as Joseph Sink, rose up against their captors in 1839, with nothing but shackles on their wrists and fire in their hearts. They took the ship, demanding to return home. Their rebellion was not only an act of defiance, but a statement that freedom still burned within them. Though the Amistad's story would later unfold in a courtroom in the United States, it echoed across time as proof that these were not voiceless, passive victims. They were people, fighting back. Yet most resistance was not written into history books. It lived in the silent refusals. The woman who stopped eating, not because she had no appetite, but as a protest against the violation of her body and her spirit. Or the elders who, during brief moments of daylight, sang coded songs that told younger captives how to endure, how to remember who they were. Some chose death over slavery, jumping into the sea rather than arriving on foreign shores as property. Others faked illness to protect their peers from further abuse. Even amid the cruelty, many retained their roles as healers, griots, or spiritual guides, passing down fragments of language, belief, and memory that would outlive the voyage. These acts of resistance were not always grand or victorious. Sometimes, resistance meant surviving one more day, whispering a lullaby from memory, or helping the weak eat when hunger became unbearable. The journey across the Atlantic, often called the Middle Passage, was not merely a test of the body, it was a war on the mind, depriving people of language, space, family, and culture was a calculated effort to erase their sense of self. Yet somehow, they held on. Even in chains, the enslaved found ways to reclaim agency. On ships where multiple ethnic groups were mixed to prevent unified rebellion, bonds still formed through gesture, rhythm, and shared suffering. Resistance was not just action, it was connection. It was the simple act of locking eyes in the dark, reminding one another, we are still human. Their resilience terrified the slavers, who responded with harsher punishments, but the fear. In truth, went both ways. Ship captains documented unrest and uprisings with unease in their logs, often resorting to extreme methods of control like confining people even tighter, arming crew members constantly, or performing sudden brutal demonstrations of punishment to break spirits before they could unite. And yet they still united. Resistance continued long after the ocean had been crossed. Many of those who survived the voyage later became leaders of uprisings in the colonies. Some passed along the stories of their survival to their children, embedding within generations the truth that even in the heart of oppression, they had fought. These stories became seeds planted in hidden corners of plantation fields and whispered under breath during moments of rest. Eventually, they grew into revolts, rebellions, and the cultural preservation that would fuel future liberation movements. It is easy to see the transatlantic slave trade only through the lens of its horrors. And those horrors are undeniable. But behind the statistics, behind the diagrams of ship decks packed with bodies, behind the terms like cargo and mortality rate, there lived a will that defied calculation. Resistance on those ships was more than a reaction, it was a refusal. A refusal to be erased, a refusal to forget where they came from, and a refusal to accept a fate imposed upon them. This part of the story reminds us that even when every freedom was stripped away, even when every moment seemed orchestrated to crush the soul, the enslaved found ways to say, we are still here. We matter. That resistance, quiet or thunderous, physical or spiritual, became the thread that wove generations together. And today, by remembering and honoring it, we acknowledge that strength and that truth. In the suffocating darkness of the slave ships, where groans replaced silence and chains scraped with every movement, a quiet kind of resistance began to take shape, not just in action but in memory. Amidst the horror of cramped decks, starving bellies, and masks, there were those who, against all odds, chose to bear witness. They saw. They remembered. And eventually, they spoke. Their words would cross oceans, just like the ships they once endured. But this time, their stories would not carry suffering, they would carry change. Oloda Equiano was just a boy when he was taken from his homeland, sold multiple times, and finally ended up aboard one of those dreaded ships. Like so many others, he had been ripped away from his family, branded, and placed in chains not for what he had done, but simply for who he was. The journey he endured was more than physical. It was a descent into a world that treated human beings as ledger entries and cargo manifests. But what set Equiano apart was what he carried inside, a determination not only to survive, but to speak, to remember, and to ensure the world would hear what had been done. Years after regaining his freedom, Equiano put pen to paper. His memoir, the interesting narrative of the life of Oloda Equiano, painted a vivid portrait of the transatlantic slave trade from the inside out. It was not written as an accusation or a political tract, it was a human cry, restrained yet powerful, recounting the foul air in the lower decks, the constant threat of violence, and the piercing sorrow of separation. He spoke of seeing men and women leap into the ocean to escape their fate, of witnessing captives who would rather face death than endure another moment chained in darkness. His words reached beyond empathy. They struck at the conscience of a society that had grown accustomed to looking away. In Britain, his testimony became a rallying point. His voice, refined through the pain of survival, became one of the most influential tools in the hands of abolitionists who had long fought to expose the horrors hidden below deck. Equiano's voice was not alone. Thomas Trotter, a ship's surgeon in the Royal Navy, was another who saw what others refused to. Assigned to vessels tasked with transporting enslaved Africans, Trotter witnessed firsthand the diseases that spread like wildfire, the skeletal frames of people deprived of food and air, and the brutal enforcement methods used to instill fear. Unlike many in his profession who looked the other way, Trotter documented everything. In his reports and later in public addresses, he described the suffering with scientific precision, but also with moral outrage. Trotter wrote of the miasma that clung to the lower decks, of the sound of children crying through the night, and of the disfigurement of spirit that no medicine could cure. He openly condemned the treatment of Africans as property and warned that no civilization could claim moral superiority while such cruelty existed under its flag. His accounts reached lawmakers and fed the growing discomfort of the British public, many of whom had never seen the human cost behind the goods they consumed. These testimonies were more than words on a page. They were a form of defiance, quiet, reasoned, but unrelenting. Through them, the voiceless gained a voice, and what had once been hidden in the belly of ships like the Brooks was now printed in newspapers, debated in Parliament, and whispered in salons. Each detail, each name, each story served as evidence that this trade was not just inhuman, it was unsustainable in the face of truth. By the late 18th century, abolitionist momentum had grown from small meetings into national campaigns. Petitions flowed in by the thousands. Artists depicted the tight packing of slave ships in diagrams so stark they could not be ignored. And at the heart of it all were the voices that had lived through the nightmare. Equiano's narrative became a bestseller. Trotter's medical authority gave weight to accusations long dismissed. Together, they transformed what had been considered a distant economic practice into an urgent moral crisis. And yet, for every Equiano or Trotter, there were countless others whose stories were never written down, whose names vanished into the ocean, into plantation fields, into the unmarked graves of history. Still, those who could speak carried something sacred, not just the right to tell their story, but the duty to do so. In remembering their testimonies, we not only honor their courage, but also preserve the link between witness and justice. Their stories were not just about suffering, they were about endurance, resistance, and the unbreakable will to be seen as human. Their words became more than memories. They became warnings, and they became the foundation of movements that would one day bring down an industry built on silence. Beneath the creaking timbers of the slave ships, beneath the smell of salt, sweat, and despair, lay something far deeper than chains or shackles could measure. The Middle Passage did not just strip people of their freedom, it tore into their very sense of identity, leaving wounds that time and silence could not easily heal. For many of the men and women crammed into the dark holds, it was not merely the threat of violence or disease that scarred them, it was the slow, unrelenting erosion of the soul, a kind of trauma that could not be seen but was always felt. For the women in particular, this journey was a nightmare from which there was no waking. Ripped from their families and villages, many had already endured terror and violence on African soil before even stepping foot on the ships. Once aboard, the suffering only deepened. Their bodies were often targeted not only as labor, but as instruments for dominance, control, and exploitation. They were not merely enslaved, they were dehumanized in the most personal ways possible. In the cramped quarters of the lower deck, where the air was thick with suffocation and the stench of sickness and fear, many women were kept apart from the men. This separation was not for their safety, but rather for the convenience of those in command. The ship officers often visited the women's quarters under the pretense of supervision. But the silence of the records and the testimonies of survivors speak volumes about what truly happened in those shadows. The psychological impact of such treatment was catastrophic. Enslaved women had no recourse, no way to defend themselves, and no language through which they could fully articulate their grief. Their suffering was silenced, not just by fear, but by the weight of being considered property, something to be sold, used, and forgotten. Many bore the pain alone, some whispering prayers in languages no one on deck could understand, others simply withdrawing into a world within themselves where they could pretend, if only briefly, that they were still whole. For many, the trauma did not end when the ship reached the shores of the Americas or the Caribbean. That journey was just the beginning of a life shaped by systemic cruelty. But the psychological scars from the voyage, watching loved ones perish beside them, experiencing humiliation without cause, and enduring the constant threat of assault, followed them into the fields and plantations. Some women would never see their children again, others would give birth while still in chains, unsure whether their babies would be sold away at a moment's notice. And yet, in the face of unimaginable horror, there was a quiet, enduring resilience. Some women found strength in caring for the sick among them, offering scraps of cloth as makeshift bandages or humming lullabies to ease the crying of infants. Others passed on whispered knowledge, songs, stories, fragments of language that kept the memory of home alive and helped maintain a sense of identity and humanity amid a world that denied them both. These acts were not small. They were revolutionary. They were a declaration that even in captivity, they would not surrender their spirit. This quiet resistance was a psychological lifeline. By preserving fragments of culture, by forging sisterhood in confinement, and by holding on to dignity even in the darkest moments, many enslaved women resisted the complete erasure of their humanity. Still, the trauma remained a silent inheritance passed down across generations, often unspoken but deeply felt. When survivors like Oloda Equiano began to share their experiences, they cracked open the door to the hidden truths of the Middle Passage. But women's stories were more often lost to time, buried under layers of shame and silence. And yet, historians today continue to piece together their voices from fragments, diaries, court testimonies, abolitionist petitions, and oral traditions that survive despite centuries of suppression. What emerges from this rediscovery is not just a tale of suffering, but one of incredible psychological endurance. It is a testament to the strength it takes not only to survive physical imprisonment, but to carry the weight of that trauma and still find ways to love, nurture, and remember. Their journey was one of the most brutal in human history. But through it all, they preserved something more powerful than any empire: the will to live, the right to remember, and the courage to endure. Even amid the suffocating darkness of the slave ships, something endured, something that chains could not bind nor whips silence. From deep within the cargo holds, where human suffering clung to the walls like mold, came voices quiet at first, then stronger, singing old songs from the homeland. These were not just melodies of grief, but acts of defiance, vessels of memory, and seeds of identity that refused to be erased. These songs, these rhythms, these spirituals, they carried the spirit of those who survived the Middle Passage, whispering of lives once lived in freedom, of families once held close, of gods who still listened even in the bowels of hell. In their harmonies was resistance, in their beats was memory, and though stripped of language, land, and lineage. The enslaved carried their culture within them. It lived in their footsteps, in the way they prepared food, in how they braided their children's hair, and in the faiths they merged and preserved. This cultural survival was not passive, it was revolutionary. Every time a mother taught her child a lullaby from the motherland, she defied the forces that sought to make her forget. Every whispered proverb, every secret ceremony beneath the moonlight, every heartbeat that refused to conform was a rebellion against the system that tried to flatten their humanity into labor and silence. And from these quiet rebellions came the heartbeat of something far greater. African diasporic identity was forged in that fire, in the rice fields of Carolina, in the sugar plantations of Jamaica, in the churches of Haiti, and the back roads of Brazil. Echoes of the past mingled with the present. A shared memory emerged, not of geography but of survival, not of homeland but of resistance. This is the legacy that lives on today, in the rhythms of blues and jazz, in the poetry of Langston Hughes and the activism of Rosa Parks, in the art, the dance, the language, and the food, in every spiritual sung in a church and every beat dropped on a street corner. This was not just survival, it was resurrection. From the belly of suffering rose a culture that shaped the modern world in ways few empires ever could. And it is this truth that we must hold on to. Especially now, when history sometimes feels like an abstract list of dates and names. Behind those numbers are real people, children who hummed songs of hope, women who whispered stories from their ancestors, men who found courage in silence, and entire communities who refused to let their light be extinguished. The story of the transatlantic slave trade is not just a chronicle of human cruelty. It is also a chronicle of human resilience, of how even the most brutal systems of oppression could not kill culture, could not silence memory, could not erase identity. This survival is not just remarkable, it is sacred. So as we reflect on this painful chapter in history, let us also honor the incredible strength it revealed. Let us amplify the voices that were once forced into silence. Let us listen not only with ears, but with hearts wide open. Because remembering is not enough. We must learn, acknowledge, and carry these stories forward with integrity, compassion, and truth. Thank you for taking the time to walk this difficult path with us through suffering and struggle, but also through dignity and survival. If this story moved you, if it helped you see history in a more human light, we invite you to support this channel. A like, a subscribe, and a comment help more than you can imagine. It tells the algorithm that stories like this matter and that truth, however painful, deserves to be seen and heard. Until next time, may your dreams be peaceful, your heart stay open, and your spirit remain unshaken. Sleep well, and good night.